On April 24, 1973, a quiet phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado, became the setting for a chilling confession. A towering man, standing at 6 feet 9 inches, dials a number that will shock the nation. His deep, steady voice confesses to a series of brutal murders, including his own mother, his grandparents, and several young women.
It started coming to a head again, so I went back down. I ran away back down there. And then a month later, I'm up living with my grandparents in the mountains, and 10 months later, I murdered them. It made it worse to be on top of a mountain. I was literally on top of a mountain when it happened. And I sensed everybody in the world just stopping what they were doing, turning around, saw what I did, and are coming to get me. And I knew I was paranoid at that moment. I knew anybody that came up there and gave me a funny look or a fishy eye or quizzical look, I'd have blown their brains out thinking they were coming to get me. And if it had been in a city, I would have been a mass murderer at age 15.
The police officer on the other end of the call asked, "Who is this?" The reply came, "I'm Edmund Kemper, the man who's turning himself in." But who is Edmund Kemper? How did this seemingly soft-spoken, intelligent man become one of America's most notorious serial killers? To uncover the answer, we must go back to where it all began. From his chilling first act of violence at age 15 to his years of manipulation and murder, this is the story of a man who took control in the most unimaginable way by confessing. Join us as we delve into the twisted mind of Edmund Kemper, piecing together his dark journey from the murder of his grandparents to his horrific spree as the co-ed killer. Through his own words, interviews, and confessions, we uncover the shocking truth.
My mother was a sick, angry, hungry, and very sad woman. I hated her, but I wanted to love my mother. And I watched the alcohol increase. I watched her social life drop off. I watched her get bizarre. She had terrible pain from her life, earlier life, her upbringing, a failed marriage with my father. I'm a constant reminder of that failure. I hate to distill it down into such into one-word realities like that. There's a lot that leads into that happening, but that is what happened. They represented not what my mother was, but what she liked, what she coveted, what was important to her, and I was destroying it.
He had first arrived during the Christmas holidays, stayed through the school year, and now found himself sent back again. But Edmund wasn't happy about it. Already 6 foot 4 inches tall and socially awkward, he was an imposing figure who made others uneasy. People shuffled him from one home to another, treating him like a burden. Frustrated and seething with anger, Kemper later described himself as a walking time bomb, yet, instead of diffusing his growing rage, those around him seemed to fuel it further.
My younger sister's 2 years younger, and I developed some morbid games. My life had started going that way at about 8. At a certain time of the evening, the family left the center room, the living room of the house. My mother and my sisters, or my sisters themselves, would go up to bed upstairs, where I used to go to bed, upstairs. I had to go down to the basement. And an 8-year-old child had a tough time differentiating the reason in that. Why am I going to the basement? I'm going to hell, they're going to heaven.
Kemper despised the way his mother treated him, and his grandmother wasn't much better. Both women constantly bossed him around and dictated his every move, fueling his resentment. By his own admission, he began harboring dark fantasies of killing and mutilating them, and they weren't his only targets.
What were those fantasies?
What were they?
Yes.
Possessing the severed heads of women. Men didn't turn me on. That wasn't I couldn't appreciate the appearances of a guy. That when I was young, I was about 8 or 9 years old, I went to this little come-on. It was like at a record store or something, and they had this crowd of kids there, and there was a magic show. And this guy, you've probably seen it, the fake guillotine, hand pressed, and they put the potato there, and someone puts their neck in the brace, and they slam this thing down, and the potato down below chops in two, but the person's head doesn't fall off, right? And everybody gets very fascinated by that. Oh my God. And then when he puts the blade in place and he pushes it down, it goes through that neck hole. But it never chops anybody's head off. Okay, so he wanted to volunteer I'm not standing in this crowd watching this show. and he wanted to volunteer out of the audience. And some quite beautiful little 16-year-old girl gets up there and it's a big laugh and you're all giddy and stuff. And I started getting caught up in this. I said, wow. Right at that moment, I departed reality because logically I should have been able to ascertain that that could not happen. You're not going to get away with chopping somebody's head off in the middle of, in the middle of Helena, Montana, the capital city.
Psychiatrist Donald Lundy, in Murder and Madness, wrote that as a child, Kemper wished for everyone in the world to die, and often imagined carrying out those killings himself. His cruelty also extended to animals. He buried a cat alive, later exhumed it, decapitated it, and mounted its head on a stick, a chilling foreshadowing of what was to come. One August afternoon, Kemper had a heated argument with his 66-year-old grandmother, Maud, in the kitchen. According to psychiatrist Donald Lundy, Kemper's pent-up rage toward his mother was often displaced onto Maud, making her a frequent target of his anger. On this day, it didn't take much to set him off. Enraged, Kemper grabbed a rifle. When Maud scolded him for aiming at birds, he turned the weapon on her instead. He shot her in the head, killing her instantly, then fired 2 more rounds into her back. Margaret Cheney, in Why the Serial Killer in America, reports that Kemper also stabbed her with a kitchen knife, while David K. Frazier, in Murder Cases of the 20th Century, specifies it was 3 times in the back. Kemper's first murder appeared to be impulsive, a violent outburst, rather than a premeditated act of evil. Now faced with the gruesome reality of what he'd done, Kemper panicked. He knew he had to conceal the crime, especially from his grandfather, who would be arriving home soon. At his towering size, thanks to a 6-foot mother and a 6 father, he had no trouble dragging Maud's lifeless body into the bedroom. Moments later, his 72-year-old grandfather, also named Edmund, pulled into the driveway. This was the man who had gifted him the very rifle he'd used to kill his grandmother the previous Christmas. Watching from the window, Kemper made a chilling decision to silence his grandfather too. As the elderly man stepped out of his car, Kemper raised the rifle and shot him without hesitation. According to Margaret Cheney, Kemper then dragged the body into the garage, completing his gruesome double murder. According to Lundy, in his twisted mind, Kemper saw the murders as a form of revenge for the rejection he had faced from both his father and his mother. Unsure of what to do next, he made a fateful call to his mother, Clarnell, in Montana. When he confessed to her, she urged him to contact the police. Perhaps Clarnell remembered the grim warning she had once given Edmund's biological father that their son might kill his grandparents one day. Following her advice, Kemper dialed the authorities. When officers arrived at the ranch, they found him sitting calmly on the porch, waiting for them to take him away. Kemper was placed in the custody of the California Youth Authority, where his chilling lack of remorse began to surface. During an interview, he casually told officers that he had shot his grandmother simply to see what it felt like. This haunting statement would become one of his most infamous quotes, cementing his image as a cold-blooded killer, even at a young age. He later claimed he killed his grandfather to spare him the pain of discovering Maud's body. For the California legal system, the idea that a 15-year-old could commit such horrific acts was almost impossible to comprehend. Kemper underwent psychiatric testing, where he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, a condition that would shape how authorities handled him moving forward. Despite his violent tendencies, Kemper was found to possess a near-genius IQ. Instead of being sent to a typical youth authority facility, he was placed in the high security Atascadero State Hospital for the criminally insane. His intelligence quickly set him apart, so much so that he was given access to psychological assessment tools and even allowed to administer them to other patients. As John Douglas explains in Mindhunter, Kemper used this opportunity to memorize responses for 28 different psychological tests, arming himself with the knowledge to manipulate future evaluations. His efforts paid off. By the time his 21st birthday approached, Kemper had successfully convinced doctors that he was rehabilitated. With his mother's help, he was released back into society. The most detailed insights into Kemper's case emerged from those who studied him closely in the 1970s, immediately following his trial. Psychiatrist Donald Lundy and authors Ward D. Mayo and Margaret Cheney had access to his trial transcripts, with Cheney describing his confessions as compulsive and deeply unsettling. Kemper also participated in a 1978 interview for Court TV's Mugshots, offering chilling reflections on his crimes. Former FBI profilers Robert R. Ressler and John Douglas spent significant time interviewing Kemper and later documented their encounters in their books. While self-reported accounts are often unreliable, Kemper's descriptions of his life and crimes proved both revealing and disturbing. His imposing physical stature, standing at 6'A" and weighing nearly 300 pounds, always drew attention, but it was his sharp intellect and unnervingly articulate manner that left the most lasting impression. By the time Kemper began his reign of terror, San Jose, California, was already reeling from a wave of violent crimes. His string of murders marked the third major case to grip the area since 1970, adding to an atmosphere of widespread fear and paranoia. After his release from Atascadero, Kemper moved to the beachside town of Santa Cruz, just south of San Francisco, surrounded by mountains, the ocean, and iconic redwood trees. Known as both a tourist destination and an upscale community, the town seemed an unlikely setting for such horrors. However, during the early 1970s, tensions were already simmering as young people, particularly hippies, flocked to the area following the opening of a new University of California campus. While the influx brought energy and change, many longtime residents viewed these newcomers as undesirable, adding to the town's growing unease. According to D. Amio, 95% of murders in America during this time were situational acts of violence stemming from domestic disputes or arguments between acquaintances. But the murders plaguing Santa Cruz in the 1970s shattered this norm. These killings were random, senseless, and terrifying. While one murderer was apprehended shortly after his crime, other cases remained unsolved for months, leaving residents gripped with fear. By 1973, the panic had reached such heights that people began arming themselves, desperate for protection against predators bold enough to invade the homes of ordinary families. In late 1970, Santa Cruz was rocked by the horrifying crimes of John Lindley Frazier, who murdered 5 people, the OTA family, and Dr. Ota's secretary, claiming he was protecting the environment from the evils of modern progress. Frazier, an extremist deeply entrenched in the hippie lifestyle, was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia but still deemed sane and convicted. His trial descended into chaos as Frazier attempted to feign insanity to mislead the jury. Public mistrust of the hippie counterculture grew, fueled by memories of Charles Manson's infamous Los Angeles murders just a year earlier. Like Manson, Frazier had invaded a home and brutally slaughtered its occupants, including 2 children, in service of his deranged ideology. In late 1972 and early 1973, Santa Cruz was gripped by terror as a series of grisly murders unfolded over just 4 months. The victims included 4 campers, a priest, a man working in his garden, a young girl, and a mother with her 2 children. The killer was eventually identified as 25-year-old Herbert Mullen. Despite a history of institutionalization and being flagged as dangerous, Mullen was released as an outpatient, free to wander the streets. Having stopped taking his antipsychotic medication, Mullen claimed he heard voices commanding him to kill. In his deluded mind, these murders were necessary sacrifices to prevent a catastrophic earthquake that, he believed, would submerge California into the ocean. Mullen believed he was destined to perform a twisted ritual he called the Die Song. He claimed telepathic messages instructed him to find 13 people willing to either sacrifice themselves or be killed by him to save California from disaster. Armed with knives, guns, or even baseball bats, he carried out his chilling mission, murdering his chosen victims one by one until the police finally apprehended him. Although he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, the courts found him legally sane, and he was convicted of 10 murders. Even before Mullen's killing spree, female hitchhikers had begun vanishing in May 1972. Desperate to calm public fear, authorities initially speculated that Mullen was behind these disappearances, hoping to convince the community that the nightmare was over. However, they soon realized they were dealing with a completely different predator, one who was even more calculated and monstrous. The Santa Cruz Sentinel, the local newspaper, later chronicled the city's dark history in a special publication, spotlighting the grim activities of 3 killers who who turned the idyllic town into a scene of terror. Reporter Tom Honig described the era as the actions of a world gone crazy. The 1970s were marked by escalating violence, and Santa Cruz became infamous for the chilling addition of Edmund Kemper to the ranks of its killers. Together, Frazier, Mullen, and Kemper claimed 28 lives, each embodying a distinct type of murderer. Frazier committed his atrocities in one brutal event, Mullen's spree was driven by delusions of a higher purpose, and Kemper meticulously operated as a serial killer. Kemper's reign of terror began before Mullen's and ended shortly after, fueled according to his interviews by years of relentless humiliation and psychological torment from his mother. When Kemper was released from Atascadero in 1969, psychiatrists strongly advised against him returning to live with his mother, Clarnell, fearing it could spark further violence. Yet, with no financial support or guidance from the youth authority, Kemper had little choice. Moving back in with Clarnell, he found himself subjected to her relentless verbal abuse once again. By this time, Clarnell had divorced her third husband and started working as an administrative assistant at a new university in Santa Cruz, where she lived in a duplex on Ord Drive in Aptos. Their frequent, heated arguments could often be heard by neighbors. Whether Clarnell's behavior directly influenced Kemper's eventual actions remains a subject of debate, but their toxic and volatile relationship undoubtedly left deep scars. In compliance with his parole, Kemper enrolled in a community college and performed well academically. However, his real aspiration was to join the police academy. When he discovered that his towering height disqualified him, he found solace by spending time in the jury room where local officers gathered. They nicknamed him Big Ed and regarded him as a polite and respectful young man. Kemper's soft-spoken demeanor, articulate speech, and intelligence left a favorable impression. He was particularly fascinated with law enforcement and idolized actors like John Wayne, a fact well known among the officers. None of them could have imagined that one day, the man they welcomed into their circle would become the subject of one of the most horrifying cases they would ever encounter. Kemper held a series of odd jobs before securing a position with the California Highway Department. With enough savings, he briefly moved out of his mother's home to Alameda, near San Francisco, where he shared an apartment with a friend. However, financial instability often forced him to return to Clarnell's toxic environment. During this time, he purchased a motorcycle but was involved in 2 separate accidents. One of them resulted in a settlement of $15,000, which he used to buy a yellow Ford Galaxy. This car would later become an infamous part of his crimes. As Kemper cruised the area, he observed young women hitchhiking, a common and carefree practice for college students along the West Coast in the 1970s. But for Kemper, these encounters were anything but innocent. In later interviews, he admitted that he would evaluate these women, considering what unspeakable acts he could commit against them. Kemper meticulously prepared his Ford Galaxy for his sinister intentions, equipping it with plastic bags, knives, a blanket, and handcuffs hidden in the trunk. All that remained was the right opportunity. For a while, he practiced restraint, picking up hitchhikers and letting them go without incident. By his own account, he gave rides to approximately 150 young women, any of whom could have been chosen as his victim. But as time went on, the dark urges he referred to as his little zapples became impossible to ignore. Eventually, he gave in to the compulsion and began his horrifying spree. On May 7, 1972, with the Frazier trial still fresh in the public's mind, Marianne Pesca and Anita Lachessa set off from Fresno State College, hitchhiking to meet friends at Stanford University. Their journey began like so many others in those days, 2 carefree college students thumbing a ride. However, when the girls failed to reach their destination, their families contacted the police. Unfortunately, hitchhiking was so common and runaway cases so frequent that investigators had little to go on. Months passed without answers until August 15th, when the severed remains of a female head were discovered in the mountains. It was identified as Marianne Pesca. Though no other remains were found, authorities concluded that both young women had met a tragic and violent end. On September 14, 1972, 15-year-old dance student Aiko Ku vanished while hitchhiking from Berkeley. A month later, on October 13th, Herbert Mullen's murders began to grip public attention. Meanwhile, in early 1973, Another young woman disappeared, 18-year-old Cindy Schall. She was hitchhiking to Cabrillo Community College after stopping briefly at a friend's house. Witnesses saw her get into a car, but she was never seen alive again.
Kid to drive. I started driving when I was 10 or 12 years old, but I got a license when I was 15 up in Montana, and then I got locked up, and then here in California, and I got out, got a license, and I just started driving. And that was my main hobby, I'd say. And I saw a lot of people out hitchhiking, and I didn't select girls to pick up. I picked up anybody who wanted a ride. And over that whole 3-year period, it was the same way. If someone needed a ride, I picked them up, unless specifically I was looking for someone to do in. All that driving around, it wasn't rehearsing. I made a game out of driving around, picking people up, and later on I discerned that some people wouldn't get in my car because of the situation. I'm a young man by myself, it's unsafe. So I thought, well, gee, that kind of put me off. I'm not doing anything to anybody, so I want to see if I can change that situation where they'll want to get in and I can take them where they're going. Because I know I'm not going to do anything. And I got to where I could diffuse that situation. It's how you're looking. If you look, oh boy, all right, you start cranking the car over there. They're not going to get in your car because they can see you from half a block away drooling. But if you look at your watch and say, geez, I don't know if I have enough time, and you're kind of in the mirror and looking around, and you pull over, this guy's just a businessman going somewhere, and get in his car, we'll go where we're going. And it's little games I played so they'd get in the car. And then we chatted, and I talked about things, and I found out where their orientations were and their little, what they used to judge and who could get in and who they could get in with and who they couldn't, right? In that sense, it's been interpreted as what do you call it, rehearsing. It's not true, it's like playing chess.
Within 2 days, gruesome discoveries began: dismembered arms and legs found on a cliff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. Shortly after, an upper torso washed ashore and was identified as Schall's through lung x-rays. A lower torso followed, and a surfer discovered her left hand, identifiable by fingerprints. However, her head and right hand were never recovered. As these grisly findings unfolded, local newspapers began referring to the perpetrator as the Chopper and the Butcher. On January 25, 1973, 2 local families were brutally murdered in their homes, escalating the fear already gripping Santa Cruz. Shortly afterward, 4 young men camping together were found executed, each shot at close range in the head. The community's horror deepened on February 5th, when 2 female hitchhikers, Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu, vanished without a trace. Police had no leads on their disappearances. Then, on February 13th, a witness reported another shocking incident: a man shot dead while gardening. This time, authorities acted swiftly, arresting Herbert Mullen. Mullen was tied to most of these recent shootings, but his methods didn't match the other crimes, particularly the disappearance of Thorpe and Liu or the earlier murders of Cindy Schall and Marianne Pesca. Unlike Mullen's straightforward executions, kidnapping and dismemberment weren't part of his modus operandi. Following Mullen's arrest, the local media played a significant role in amplifying the climate of fear. According to D. television reporter Marilyn Baker became particularly notorious for sensationalizing events. She frequently exaggerated rumors and presented unverified information as fact, much to the frustration of law enforcement and the alarm of citizens. Baker's reports often featured claims of satanic rituals and attempted to connect unrelated murders under a single narrative. She described the Butcher murders as unique, claiming the decapitations and dismemberments displayed a level of precision that suggested professional expertise. Baker further alleged that bodies were placed in slanted positions to ensure blood drained efficiently, facilitating the dismemberment process, a chilling detail that only deepened the public's unease. Baker further fueled the hysteria by claiming that 1 or more victims had been held captive before their deaths. She highlighted grisly details, such as the slicing of Cindy Schall's Achilles tendon, and went as far as suggesting the killer might be a lesbian or transvestite. Her sensational reports frequently criticized law enforcement for perceived missteps in the investigation. Baker even speculated that the murders followed a specific pattern, occurring on Mondays after dark and during full moons, claims that were entirely unfounded but conveniently fed into the narrative of cult activity. Her dramatic theories, while captivating for the public, created more confusion and frustration for investigators. On March 4th, 2 hikers made a grim discovery near Highway 1 in San Mateo County, a human skull and a jawbone. Police quickly realized these remains did not belong to the same person. A search of the area revealed a second skull that matched the jawbone, confirming the presence of 2 victims killed and discarded together. Comparing the remains to reports of missing hitchhikers, authorities identified them as Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu. The investigation revealed that Liu had been shot twice in the head, while Thorpe had been shot once.
I was losing a grasp on something that was too violent to keep inside forever. As I'm sitting there with a severed head in my hand, talking to it, or looking at it, and I'm about to go crazy, literally. I'm about to go completely flywheel loose and just fall apart. I say, wow, this is insane. And then I told myself, no, it isn't. You're saying that, and that makes it not insane. I said, I'm sane, and I'm looking at a severed... I said, well, wait a minute. I see old paintings and drawings of Viking heroes talking to severed heads and taking them to parties, old enemies in leather bags. Part of our heritage. This is me back then, in 1972 and 73. Unable to live with the fact that I just stabbed to death and cut the throat of an innocent young woman. Innocent in the sense that she did not plan on that happening. She didn't do anything specifically for that to happen to her. Yet she was a very active participant in her own death. And in my memory of that, she was 19 years old, and her roommate in the trunk who died right after that was 18. I didn't go hog wild and totally limp. What I'm saying is, I found myself doing things in an attempt to make things fit together inside. I was doing sexual probings and things. I mean, in the sense of striking out and reaching out and grabbing and pulling to me, but appalled at the sense that it wasn't working. That isn't the way it's supposed to be. It isn't the way I want it. See what I'm saying?
The chilling discovery prompted the university to implement a bus system to provide safer transportation for off-campus students, hoping to prevent more tragedies. Authorities were overwhelmed as the Santa Cruz area spiraled into a nightmare of murders and missing young women. Leads were scarce, and the killings showed no signs of stopping. The crisis even caused a sharp decline in university enrollment as fear took hold. Then, in an unexpected twist, the killing spree came to an end not through police intervention, but by the killer's own actions. On April 23, 1973, the Santa Cruz police received a startling phone call. On the line was a 24-year-old man calling from a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado. This wasn't just any caller. It was Big Edmund Kemper, the man who had shared meals and conversations with police officers now calmly confessing to murder. Kemper's confession wasn't limited to 1 or 2 murders, it was far worse. Just 4 days earlier, on Good Friday, he had killed his mother, Clarnell Strandberg, in a fit of rage. After the murder, he calmly went out drinking with his police friends, showing no sign of the horror he had just committed.
She came home, went to sleep. I was woken up by that. Came out. I walked up to her bed. She's laying there reading a paperback, as many thousands of nights before. And she said, "Oh, I suppose you're going to want to sit up all night and talk now." Shit. I looked at her. I said, "No." I said, "Good night." And I knew I was going to kill her, you know? And I'm so cold, it's so hard. And that's the first time in 10 years I've looked at it that way. I mean, that intensely, that honestly. It hurts. Because I'm not a lizard, I'm not from under a rock. I came out of her vagina. See? I came out of my mother. And in a rage, I went right back in. For 7 years, she said, I haven't had sex with a man because of you, my murderous son, is one of our arguments. And I cut off her head, and I humiliated her corpse. I said, there, you know, a 6 young woman dead because of the way she raises her son and the way her son is raised, the way he grows up. And what's her closing words? I suppose you want to sit up all night and talk. God, I wish I had.
Later that night, he invited his mother's friend, Sarah Sally Hallett, over for dinner and a movie. Sally eagerly accepted, unaware of the fate awaiting her. Upon her arrival, Kemper killed her as well and decapitated her. He stuffed both women's bodies into closets in the duplex on Ord Drive. Afterward, Kemper fled, driving aimlessly for several days. He eventually abandoned one car, rented a green Chevy Impala, and finally decided to surrender himself to the police. Kemper revealed that he had been awake for 3 days, fueled by no-dose pills, and described himself as feeling half crazy over the phone. He calmly confessed to a string of unsolved murders, repeatedly referring to the victims as the co-eds. Despite his disturbing admissions, his primary request was simple: he wanted someone to come and pick him up. Kemper explained that he had 200 rounds of ammunition and 3 firearms in his car, which he found terrifying, and he was ready to surrender. However, the officer who answered his call assumed it was a prank, a claim noted by David Everett in Human Monsters. The officer dismissed him, advising him to call back later. Undeterred, Kemper made multiple calls, struggling to convince anyone to take his shocking confession seriously. To those who knew Kemper, his claims seemed too bizarre to be true, a dark joke from a man with a strange sense of humor. Undeterred by the skepticism, Kemper persisted, calling repeatedly until he convinced an officer to investigate his mother's house. He pointed out that Sergeant Alufi, an officer who had recently confiscated a .44 caliber revolver from him, would recognize the significance of the situation. Alufi, familiar with Kemper and his demeanor, decided to act. The sergeant went to the duplex on Ord Drive himself to confirm the unsettling claims. As Sergeant Alufi stepped inside, the stench of decomposition hit him immediately. Opening the closet, he discovered blood and hair, exactly as Kemper had described. He quickly secured the scene and called in the coroner and detectives, who confirmed the presence of 2 bodies, just as Kemper had confessed. Both bodies had been decapitated, with Clarnell's head showing signs of severe battering, allegedly used for dart practice. Kemper revealed that her tongue and larynx had been chopped up and stuffed into the garbage disposal, which had rejected the grisly remains. It was now clear to investigators how the co-ed butcher had managed to evade capture for so long. John Douglas noted that Kemper had used his access to the jury room and investigation details to refine his methods. By studying law enforcement strategies, Kemper was able to stay one step ahead, evading capture. Despite the warnings issued to students, he had mastered the art of appearing harmless, a skill that allowed him to lure unsuspecting girls into his car with ease. Peter Chang and a team of detectives traveled across 3 states to retrieve Kemper from the detention center where local police had placed him. They found him waiting calmly, fully aware of his own dangerous nature and the need to be confined. Kemper showed no hesitation to talk, waiving his right to an attorney twice, though he later claimed to have requested one. The story Kemper told was unlike anything the detectives had ever encountered. For hours, he detailed his murders: 6 co-eds, his mother, her friend, and his grandparents years earlier, bringing his total to 10. To back up his claims, he led detectives to locations where he had hidden or discarded parts of his victims. Kemper also confessed to having sex with the severed heads, describing how it gave him a twisted sense of possession and control over his victims. As the trial progressed, the revelations became even more disturbing, fueled by intensive psychiatric evaluations. Both the defense and prosecution worked tirelessly to determine how to handle this profoundly unsettling young man. I was born in Burbank, California, on December 18, 1948, as the middle child of E.E. Edmund Jr., he had an older sister by 6 years and a younger sister by 2.5 years. While Edmund shared a bond with his father, their family fractured when E.E. divorced Clarnell in 1957, leaving 9-year-old Edmund to move to Montana with his mother and siblings. The separation hit him hard, and he later claimed that his mother, in an attempt to toughen him up, began locking him in the basement. Kemper would later offer varying motives for his actions, tailoring them to whoever was interviewing him. He often expressed the belief that his very existence served as a painful reminder to his mother of her failed marriage. While he harbored deep hatred for her, he sometimes spoke with an air of understanding about her motives and behavior. "My mother was a sick, angry, hungry, and very sad woman," Kemper once said. "I hated her, but I wanted to love my mother. I watched as the alcohol took over, as her social life faded away, and as she became more and more bizarre. She carried terrible pain from her past, her childhood, her upbringing, and her failed marriage to my father. I was a constant reminder of that failure. In various interviews, Kemper recounted the fear and anger that defined his childhood, alongside the dark fantasies that consumed him. He admitted that killing the family cat and placing its head on an altar made him feel powerful, especially after he managed to lie convincingly about it. This incident marked the beginning of his ability to maintain a trustworthy public facade, even as his inner world grew increasingly sinister. Everett indicates that by the time he was 10, he was already thinking about females in sexual terms. He was also developing a violent inner world. When I was in school, Kemper said in a taped interview, I was called a chronic daydreamer, and I saw a counselor twice during junior high and high school, and that was very routine. They didn't ask me a lot of questions about myself, and that was probably the most violent fantasy time I was off into. Accounts from Kemper's sisters painted a disturbing picture of his childhood. Frazier noted that one sister once dared him to kiss a teacher, to which he chillingly replied that if he did, he'd have to kill her afterward. His younger sister recalled his habit of decapitating her dolls, a sinister precursor to his later crimes. Their mother, seemingly sensing his troubling tendencies, confined him to the basement to keep him away from the girls, a decision that, in hindsight, proved to be alarmingly justified. Kemper once reflected, I lived as an ordinary person most of my life. Even though I was living a parallel and increasingly violent other life at the age of 13, he killed his own pet cat with a machete, hiding the remains in his closet. The gruesome discovery was later made by his mother. Cheney provides chilling details of this incident, drawn directly from Kemper's own accounts. That same year, Kemper ran away from home, determined to live with his father. He believed life with his father would be better, but upon arrival, he realized that his father, now remarried with another son, was not as welcoming as he had hoped. Although E.E. allowed him to stay for a short time, he ultimately sent Kemper back to Montana. Clarnell, however, was equally unwilling to take him back. She was preparing to marry her third husband and viewed her overgrown adolescent son as too much to handle. Her solution was to send Kemper to live with his paternal grandparents on their ranch in California. According to Kemper, as detailed in mugshots, it was actually his father who decided to send him there. Frazier notes that Kemper ran away twice, with his second attempt landing him at his grandparents' home. I went to live with Dad, Kemper recalled, and he sends me up to Grandma. Now she's going to undo all the terrible things my mother did to me. I'm going to be a showpiece. She's going to show the world that my mother was a lousy parent. I'm going to be a pawn in this little game. This arrangement, as Kemper later recounted, was deeply unpleasant for him. It was at his grandparents' ranch, living with Maud and Edmund Kemper Sr., that Edmund's descent into murder began. After his release from the psychiatric hospital years later, Kemper expressed a desire to become a police officer. As Lundy noted, the parole board that approved his release included no psychologists or psychiatrists, nor was there any follow-up psychiatric care planned for him. Disheartened by his inability to find suitable employment, Kemper grew increasingly frustrated. Though he shared an apartment with a friend for a time, he feared that he might eventually have to move back in with his mother. This fear became reality, and living with Clarnell would ultimately seal both of their fates. Much like she had with her 3 ex-husbands, Clarnell relentlessly berated Edmund, targeting his masculinity and self-worth. He expressed a desire to socialize, but she refused to introduce him to any women on campus. She's holding up these girls who said they were too good for me to get to know, he recalled. Her cutting remarks stung deeply. You're just like your father. You don't deserve to get to know them. Enraged by her constant ridicule, Kemper began cruising the streets, seeking the women he believed he could never have. Kemper knew how to lure women on his terms. He often picked up hitchhikers, recounting in an interview, "I'm picking up young women, and I'm going a little bit further each time. It's a daring kind of thing." Initially, he carried no weapon, simply driving to secluded areas where he could act, but then hesitated. "I say no, I can't." Over time, he began hiding a gun in his car. This craving, this awful raging, eating feeling inside this fantastic passion, it was overwhelming me, he described. It was like drugs, like alcohol. A little isn't enough. Everything shifted for Kemper on May 7, 1972. Long before Mullen's murderous spree gripped the area, Kemper decided it was time to act. It was stupid for anyone to hitchhike, he later remarked. But to these people who thought it was fun and exciting, maybe even a little daring, it is as if they're dead drawing strategies from police novels. He learned tactics like keeping the car door locked once his victims were inside. He also mastered how to create a false sense of security, ensuring they felt safe with him. Clarnell had obtained a university parking sticker for Kemper's Ford, enabling him to move freely around the campus without arousing suspicion. Interestingly, her colleagues at the university described her as charming and easy to get along, with a stark contrast to Edmund's accounts of her. Despite their toxic relationship, Clarnell still provided him with support and allowed him to live under her roof. On this fateful day, Kemper picked up two 18-year-old college students, Marianne Pesky and Anita Lachessa, who were hitchhiking. His initial plan was to sexually assault them, but he quickly decided on murder to ensure there would be no witnesses. It was the first time I went looking for someone to kill, Kemper later admitted. And it's two people, not one, and they're dead. Very naive, too painfully naive, and they thought they were streetwise. At first, the girls were genuinely grateful for the ride. Their destination, Stanford, was about an hour away, and Kemper had assured them he'd take them all the way. They couldn't believe their good fortune. However, their relief quickly turned to fear as Kemper veered off the highway and stopped on a secluded dirt road. It was then the girls began to realize something was terribly wrong. Kemper escalated the situation, taunting the girls by telling them he planned to sexually assault them and take them to his apartment. However, his time in Atascadero had taught him one thing from listening to other rapists: it was safer to leave no witnesses. Acting on this dark logic, he handcuffed Marianne Pesky to the back seat and forced Anita Lachessa into the trunk of the car. Kemper's attempt to smother Pesky failed, as did his initial effort to stab her. The knife blade struck her backbone, causing pain but no fatal injury. Pesky fiercely fought back, even biting through the bag he had placed over her head. Frustrated, Kemper ultimately slit her throat, killing her. He then turned to Lachessa, whose murder proved to be more difficult and chaotic than he had anticipated. With two lifeless bodies in his possession, Kemper faced an unnerving close call. While driving toward Alameda, he was pulled over by a police officer for a broken taillight. Remaining calm and polite, Kemper managed to avoid suspicion, receiving only a warning. Later, he admitted that the encounter had thrilled him. If the officer had decided to check the trunk, Kemper chillingly confessed he was prepared to kill him without hesitation. When Kemper arrived in Alameda, he found his roommate was out, giving him the privacy he needed to carry out his gruesome plans. He wrapped the bodies in blankets, moved them from the car trunk, and brought them into his apartment. Laying the corpses on the floor, Kemper began his macabre work, later detailing every disturbing step during his confession. Kemper brought the bodies into his bedroom, where he began taking photographs of them. As he dismembered them, he continued capturing images, pausing intermittently to indulge in the twisted satisfaction of having complete control over his victims. He later admitted to performing sexual acts with the severed body parts, a grim extension of his need for dominance. Kemper placed Pesky's dismembered remains in a bag and buried them in a shallow grave in the mountains, carefully noting the location for potential return visits. Before discarding their heads in a ravine, he used Pesky's head for sexual gratification. After disposing of both heads, Kemper resumed the facade of normalcy, picking up hitchhiking girls and dropping them off safely, as if nothing had happened. Kemper often engaged his hitchhikers in conversation about the ongoing hunt for the killer targeting young women, all the while silently evaluating them as potential victims. When someone put their hand on my car door handle, he chillingly remarked, "They were giving me their life." This twisted routine carried on until September 14, 1972. On September 14, 1972, Kemper picked up 15-year-old Aiko Ku, who had grown tired of waiting for her bus and decided to hitchhike. By then, Kemper had been consumed by the dark energy fueling his murderous fantasies. Though surprised to learn she was so young, he was undeterred. This girl, he decided, would become his next victim. Reflecting on his encounter with Aiko, Kemper said, "I pulled the gun out to show her I had it. She was freaking out. Then I put the gun away, and that had more of an effect than pulling it out." At one point, Kemper accidentally locked himself out of the car, briefly giving Aiko an opportunity to escape. She could have reached over and grabbed the gun, he later remarked. But I think she never gave it a thought. Instead, paralyzed by fear, she unlocked the door and allowed him back inside. Kemper forced Aiko into unconsciousness by pinching her nostrils shut, according to Fraser, and then sexually assaulted her. He later strangled her to death, stashing her lifeless body in the trunk of his car. Afterward, Kemper casually stopped for a few drinks before returning home, where he dismembered and dissected her body just as he had done with his previous victims. After experiencing the twisted thrill of exerting complete control over his victims, Kemper knew he wouldn't be able to stop for long. But before he could continue his murderous spree, he needed to deceive the psychiatrist monitoring his case into believing that he was fully rehabilitated. Just one day after killing Aiko Ku, Kemper appeared before a panel of psychiatrists for a routine parole review. On paper, he seemed like a success story. He was excelling in school, actively seeking employment, and appeared to have avoided any trouble. Knowing exactly what they wanted to hear, Kemper skillfully delivered a convincing performance. The first psychiatrist spent some time speaking with Kemper and concluded there was no reason to view him as a threat. The second went even further, describing Kemper as normal and safe according to Cheney. Both doctors recommended sealing his juvenile records, believing it would aid his reintegration into society as a better citizen. While the psychiatrists praised their success in rehabilitating a child killer, Kemper quietly reveled in the dark truth they couldn't see. According to D'Amio, not only had Kemper murdered a girl just the day before, but her severed head sat hidden in the trunk of his car during the evaluation, an accusation Kemper later denied. Regardless, he had successfully fooled the system once again, resuming his deadly game. Kemper had masterfully deceived the psychiatrists into believing he was reformed, leading them to misjudge him as no longer a threat. Although the judge harbored doubts, there was no legal basis to reject the request to seal Kemper's juvenile records. As a result, 8 years after murdering his grandparents, Kemper walked free once again. Driving away with a clean bill of mental health, Kemper felt a grim satisfaction. Now unburdened by oversight, he was free to resume his dark experiments. Shortly afterward, he buried Aiko Ku's head and hands in a remote area above Boulder Creek, where they would remain hidden until their discovery the following May. Kemper, however, was far from done. Though Kemper kept a low profile for a time, his mind remained consumed by fantasies of killing young women. To relive his gruesome acts, he held on to trophies and photographs from his victims. Meanwhile, frequent clashes with his domineering mother only fueled his growing urge to kill again. Kemper later attempted to rationalize his crimes, attributing them to deep frustrations and insecurities. "My frustration, my inability to communicate socially and sexually," he explained. "I wasn't impotent. I was scared to death of failing in male-female relationships." Kemper acquired a .22 caliber pistol and began searching for his next victim, a young, attractive hitchhiker. On January 7, 1973, he picked up Cindy Schall, who willingly accepted a ride. Driving her to a secluded area, he wasted no time and shot her quickly. This time, his goal wasn't prolonged suffering, but simply possessing a body to fulfill his disturbing desires. Living with his mother once more, Kemper brought Cindy Schall's lifeless body home and dismembered her in the bathtub. He kept her remains in his room overnight before beheading her and burying the head in the backyard. The rest of the body was disposed of over a cliff, but the ocean soon carried the parts ashore. Despite this, Kemper was confident he wouldn't be linked to the crime. He had meticulously removed the bullet from her skull, and his hunch was correct. No one suspected him. On February 5th, following a particularly explosive argument with his mother, Kemper went hunting for victims once more. That day, Rosalind Thorpe and Allison Liu vanished from campus. Kemper first picked up Rosalind, whose calm demeanor seemed to reassure Allison enough for her to climb into the car without hesitation. Miss Lou was sitting in the back, right behind Miss Thorpe, Kemper later recalled. Driving calmly, he commented on the beautiful view, even hesitating for a few moments before acting. Slowly, he moved his pistol from his lap, raised it, and fired. Thorpe slumped against the window as the shot hit her. Lou panicked, flailing her hands as she tried to defend herself. "I had to fire through her hands," Kemper explained, missing twice before finally striking her. Kemper eventually struck Lou in the temple with a shot, then aimed and fired again. However, as he neared the university gate, she was reportedly still alive, her labored breathing and faint moans breaking the silence. Some accounts claim she had already succumbed to her injuries by this point, but others describe her lingering signs of life during the drive. At the university security gate, 2 young men on duty spotted Kemper's university sticker and waved him through without hesitation. The bodies of Thorpe and Lou, wrapped in blankets, were hidden in plain sight, one even placed in the front passenger seat. Kemper later revealed he had casually told the guard the women were drunk and he was helping them back to their dorms. The guard believed him, and at that moment, Kemper felt invincible. Kemper later admitted, "It was getting easier to do. I was getting better at it." He brought Thorpe and Lou's bodies back to his mother's home, where he dismembered and beheaded them while his mother and neighbors remained obliviously close by. Some reports suggest he beheaded them in the car before carrying a headless corpse inside to fulfill his grotesque fantasies. Kemper knew the risk he was taking. Any neighbor passing by and glancing through the window could have witnessed his unspeakable acts, but no one did. The following morning, he disposed of the dismembered limbs in the ocean and scattered other body parts in the hills, discarding the heads separately. His 4th spree of killing was complete, but soon, his growing rage would lead him to a much closer target. After taking the lives of 6 young women, the towering 6 at Kemper directed his fury toward his ultimate target, his mother. While many experts later theorized that his earlier murders were symbolic rehearsals for killing her, and that her death marked the end of his spree, Kemper himself offered a very different explanation. In an interview, Kemper claimed that he sensed law enforcement closing in after Sergeant Alufi questioned him about his firearm. He stated that he killed his mother to spare her the humiliation of discovering he was the notorious co-ed butcher. However, the brutal way he handled her corpse painted a much darker and vengeful picture. Kemper admitted he feared his mother might have discovered the trophies he had taken from his victims. This left him torn between fleeing or killing her. "I can't get away from her," he confessed. "She knows all my buttons, and I dance like a puppet." The decision to kill her was inevitable, but Kemper waited patiently for the right moment to strike. One evening, after returning home from a night out with friends, Kemper's mother appeared tipsy, though some reports dispute her inebriated state. Kemper entered her room, and as he later recounted, she greeted him with the words, "I suppose you want to talk now." His response was chillingly simple, "No." In a 1978 interview, Kemper revealed that he began to cry, covering his mouth with his hand, a rare moment where his composure broke. Unlike the emotionless demeanor he displayed when recounting his other murders, his mother's death stirred something deeper, revealing just how significant this act was to him. Kemper waited for his mother to fall asleep before entering her room, claw hammer in hand. It was so hard, he later admitted, acknowledging the pain of recalling the moment. After killing her, he decapitated her and desecrated the body. "I cut off her head, and I humiliated her," of course he confessed, blaming her for the way she had shaped him. Later, Kemper admitted he wished his mother had stayed awake to talk to him that night. Instead, after her death, he placed her severed head on the mantel and spoke to it, finally saying everything he had always wanted. In a twisted act of closure, he threw darts at the head, relishing the fact that, for the first time, she couldn't argue back. Yet, even in his satisfaction, he knew this was the end for him. Kemper knew there was no escaping the consequences of this crime. Before leaving, he wrote a chilling note, as quoted in Cheney's book approximately 5:15 a.m., Saturday. "No need for her to suffer any more at the hands of this horrible, murderous butcher. It was quick. Sleep. The way I wanted it." These words marked the conclusion of his violent rampage. Some reports suggest that Kemper believed adding a second victim might divert suspicion. Acting on this, he invited his mother's friend, Sally Hallett, to the house. Once she arrived, Kemper punched and strangled her before placing her naked body on his bed. He spent the night in the house with both corpses, surrounded by blood. Disturbingly, one account alleges that he attempted necrophilia with Hallett's body. Kemper decapitated Hallett as well before fleeing the next morning, Easter Sunday, in her car. While driving, he tuned into the radio, expecting to hear reports of the gruesome discovery. To his dismay, there was no news coverage. Disappointed and restless, Kemper drove nearly 1,500 miles to Pueblo, Colorado, where he decided to take matters into his own hands and ensure the bodies were found. Kemper stopped at a phone booth and calmly called the police, confessing to his crimes. He made no effort to hide the evidence, directing authorities to where he had buried Cynthia Shaw's head in his mother's backyard. As Kemper chillingly explained to a detective, he buried it there so he could take satisfaction in knowing she was on my property, looking toward the sky. While being transported back to California, Kemper provided law enforcement with chillingly precise details about each murder. He even guided them to the locations where he had disposed of his victims' remains. On May 7, 1973, he was formally indicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder. His defense was led by Santa Cruz County's chief public defender, Jim Jackson, who had previously represented other notorious killers like Frazier and Mullen. Jackson mounted an insanity defense for Kemper, though the case was already challenging. Kemper's exhaustive confession, given without legal counsel, left the defense with few options. However, convincing the jury would be no small task. Kemper's calm, articulate manner and the methodical planning of his crimes painted a portrait of a man fully aware of his actions. Despite psychiatric evaluations declaring Kemper sane, his earlier diagnosis of psychosis gave Jackson a glimmer of hope for the insanity defense. Kemper's mental instability appeared evident when, while awaiting trial, he attempted suicide twice by slashing his wrists, both attempts unsuccessful. The trial commenced on October 23, 1973, with 3 prosecution psychiatrists asserting that Kemper was sane. Dr. Joel Fort, who delved into Kemper's juvenile records and earlier psychotic diagnosis, presented his findings. After extensive interviews, including sessions under truth serum, Fort testified that Kemper had likely engaged in acts of cannibalism. Fort testified that Kemper had allegedly cooked and consumed parts of his victims after dismembering them. Despite these grotesque acts, Fort concluded that Kemper was fully aware of his actions and the moral implications, even deriving a twisted satisfaction from his infamy. This clarity of intent was enough for the court to deem him sane. California applied the widely accepted legal standard for determining sanity. A defendant could be considered insane if a mental disease or defect prevented them from understanding their actions were wrong. In Kemper's case, his actions demonstrated a clear awareness of their immorality, along with meticulous premeditation and planning, solidifying the court's judgment of sanity. One defense psychiatrist argued that Kemper's actions were the product of a diseased mind, citing the product standard of insanity. While this approach differed subtly, it didn't align with California's legal definition. Kemper's younger sister provided unsettling details about his strange behavior, while Jackson relentlessly cross-examined the prosecution's experts, trying to highlight the extreme abnormality of Kemper's actions. Despite some acknowledgement of the defense's arguments, the prosecution experts maintained their original stance. They also challenged the diagnosis Kemper received at Atascadero, suggesting that a vivid fantasy life alone didn't equate to psychosis. On November 1st, Kemper took the stand. The jury had already heard much of his chilling confession and was well aware of the details of his crimes. Kemper explained his mental state to the jury, suggesting that his compulsive need to possess women and engage in necrophilia reflected his instability. He had previously expressed remorse to his interrogators, admitting that he turned to alcohol to cope with his guilt. However, he also revealed the disturbing thrill he felt from decapitating his victims, describing murder as a narcotic that fueled his desires. Kemper also spoke of feeling like 2 separate personalities inhabited his body, with his killer persona taking over in a blackout-like state. He claimed this was the case when he murdered his grandmother as well. The trial itself lasted just under 3 weeks, and the veracity of his disturbing confessions remains uncertain. Although he initially confessed to cannibalism during Dr. Fort's assessment, he later recanted, explaining that it was part of his attempt to secure an insanity defense. On November 8th, after 5 hours of deliberation, the 6-man, 6-woman jury found Kemper sane and guilty of 8 counts of first-degree murder. Despite his hope for the death penalty, Kemper's conviction came during a period when the Supreme Court had imposed a moratorium on capital punishment, meaning all death sentences were automatically commuted to life imprisonment. The death penalty was only applicable to crimes committed after January 1st, 1974. When the judge asked Kemper what punishment he thought was appropriate, Kemper quickly responded, having contemplated this moment since childhood. He suggested that he should be tortured to death. However, his wish was not granted. Instead, he was sentenced to life in prison. Initially sent to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville for observation, Kemper was later transferred to the maximum security prison at Folsom. During his time there, he requested psychosurgery, a procedure that would insert a probe into his brain to destroy certain tissues and possibly cure his compulsive sexual aggression. His request was denied, likely due to concerns that he might use it as grounds to seek release. Kemper became a model inmate, assisting with reading books on tape for the blind, yet when he appeared before the parole board, he admitted he was unfit to return to society. In prison, he was described as cooperative and kind, expressing a desire to forget his past. While he willingly participated in interviews and self-examination, hoping to provide insights into offenders like himself, he often disagreed with how some interviewers portrayed him. Cheney noted that when she requested access to his juvenile records, Kemper refused to cooperate. However, his interactions with other professionals reveal a different side. FBI Special Agents John Douglas and Robert R. Ressler, both part of the Behavioral Science Unit in the 1970s, had the idea to visit prisons and interview infamous killers while working with local law enforcement. The goal was to incorporate these interviews into a growing database of traits and behaviors of known killers, which would provide a foundation for their work in profiling unknown suspects. Both Douglas and Ressler have written about these prison visits in their books, and they were often the primary team conducting these interviews. In Mindhunter, Douglas writes, "If you want to understand the artist, look at his work. The team reached out to various offenders, mass murderers, assassins, and serial killers, gathering data from 118 victims, including some who had survived attempts on their lives. Their objective was to learn how the crimes were planned and executed, what the killers thought and did afterward, the fantasies driving them, and their behavior before committing their next act." Edmund Kemper was one of the 36 men who agreed to be interviewed, and Ressler recounts a chilling encounter with him. Kemper, in conversations with private correspondents, mocked the stories told by a psychiatrist who claimed these interviews were perilous. He might have fabricated such tales to heighten the danger, or perhaps simply enjoyed deceiving people for amusement. Cheney shares a similar account about a female correspondent who may have reminded Kemper of Sarah Hallett. Ressler, who includes a photo of himself with Kemper, recounts that during his third interview at Vacaville Prison, Kemper made his move. On the previous visits, Ressler had been accompanied by a colleague, but this time, believing he had gained Kemper's trust, he decided to go in alone. Ressler and Kemper were locked in a small cell near death row for 4 hours. Ressler pressed the button to call for a guard, but no one came. He continued to press it, but still, no one responded. Ressler later reflected that Kemper seemed to sense his growing anxiety. At one point, Kemper told him to relax, adding, "If I went apeshit in here, you'd be in a lot of trouble, wouldn't you? I could screw your head off and place it on the table to greet the guard." Ressler tried to buy time, mentally sparring with Kemper and attempting to project confidence, as if he had a way to defend himself. Eventually, a guard arrived, and Kemper nonchalantly claimed he had been joking. After that, Ressler never interviewed him alone again. In Mindhunter, Douglas described similar encounters with Kemper, noting that he and Ressler conducted several interviews over the years. They found Kemper to be one of the most intellectually sharp inmates they had ever spoken with. Douglas provides a detailed impression of Kemper, admitting he was surprised that Kemper had agreed to speak with them. Douglas believed Kemper's interest was driven by curiosity about them and their motives. His first impression of Kemper was that he was massive, someone who could easily overpower any of them. But it quickly became apparent that Kemper was not just physically imposing, he was also highly intelligent and self-aware. He clearly enjoyed talking as well. Douglas recalls that Kemper spoke with them for hours, and because they had thoroughly studied his case, they quickly picked up on his attempts to deceive them. Realizing they were not fooled, Kemper relaxed and began to speak openly. Kemper came across as distant and analytical, only becoming emotionally charged when discussing his mother. He believed she hated him because he resembled his father, and that she used him as a scapegoat for her own frustrations. Kemper claimed that his mother made him sleep in a windowless basement, fearing he would molest his sister. In that dark space, Kemper said, he allowed his hatred for women to fester. His mother made him feel dangerous and ashamed, which led him to kill 2 family cats. As he got older, his feelings grew even stronger, yet he continued to live with his mother, the person he despised most. Having studied psychological assessments in detail, Kemper knew exactly how to present himself using the right psychiatric terminology, mastering the key phrases, as Douglas noted. What intrigued both Douglas and Ressler the most was how Kemper viewed his actions as a game. Kemper learned how to put girls at ease, making them believe they were safe with him. This, Douglas wrote, hinted at something more troubling. The usual cues, common sense assumptions, body language, verbal signals don't work when assessing sociopaths. From their conversations, Douglas summarized Kemper's approach: manipulation, domination, control. Douglas emphasized the importance of violent fantasies for sexual predators. Kemper had developed these fantasies early in life, using them to rehearse the connection between sex and death. To truly possess someone, he believed, meant to take their life. His confession confirmed this. Kemper explained that he wanted his victims to belong to him entirely, viewing it as a way to exact revenge on the kids who had rejected him throughout his childhood. Ultimately, Kemper's greatest fantasy was to rid himself of his mother. He told Douglas that before killing anyone, he would quietly enter her room while she slept and imagine striking her with a hammer. Based on what Kemper shared about her, Douglas believed that Clarnell had played a pivotal role in shaping him into a serial killer, one who practiced on other victims before finally targeting his true frustration. Despite everything, Douglas admitted that he liked Ed. He was friendly, open, sensitive, and even had a good sense of humor. Douglas believed Kemper's fascination with dismemberment was more fetishistic than sadistic. However, Dr. Donald Lundy, who was deeply involved in the fear and panic in Santa Cruz, offered a different perspective in murder and madness. Lundy had also worked on cases involving John Lindley Frazier and Herb Mullen, and when Kemper's case came up, he was granted access to the trial transcripts by Kemper's defense attorney. Lundy, however, saw Kemper differently from Mullen or Frazier. He believed that Kemper was fully aware of his actions and took pleasure in their perversion. According to Lundy, Kemper's sexual aggression was rooted in childhood anger and violent fantasies. He also noted that Kemper's complicated relationship with his mother was typical among sexual sadists, who often incorporate the killing of their mother into their fantasies. For them, the act of killing becomes an intensely sexual experience. Lundy noted that Kemper's anger began at a young age, especially after being separated from his father. He blamed his mother entirely for this, even though she had expressed concern about the absence of a father figure in his life. Lundy also recorded troubling memories shared by Kemper's younger sister. She recalled how he would stage his own execution as a childhood game, having her lead him to a chair, blindfold him, and then pretend to die in a gas chamber after pulling an imaginary lever. Kemper also revealed to Lundy his intense interest in weapons and his growing desire to kill women. Instead of people, Kemper took his violent fantasies out on cats. He even imagined killing everyone in town and having sexual relations with corpses. While he seemed to desire a relationship with a woman, he felt so inadequate that he concluded his only option was to kill them. He would also engage in necrophilia. Lundy expressed regret that the time Kemper spent in psychiatric care as a child hadn't stopped his violent development. He suggested that for sexual sadists like Kemper, sexual and violent impulses may eventually merge into a dangerous, inseparable force. Effective treatment for someone like Kemper would have needed to start much earlier in his childhood. The challenge, however, is identifying such children, as they often keep their fantasies hidden and deny involvement in even minor offenses. Kemper, however, is one of the few serial killers who has openly shared an extensive amount of detail about his crimes and his dark fantasies. Despite how unsettling his revelations are, his willingness to talk has given us valuable insight into the development of a sexual predator. Kemper stands out among serial killers for the extraordinary level of detail he has provided about his crimes and fantasies. Although his revelations are deeply unsettling, we can take away valuable knowledge about the development of a sexual predator from his willingness to share them.